Hi, everybody. I hope this finds you well and you are having a very productive day. It's a wonderful Sunday here in Florida, and I thought I would talk a little bit about some of the recent findings of the Shroud of Turin because I just discovered from my friend Joe Moreno that there is another discovery on the Shroud of Turin that has given it the dating of 2,000 years old. And of course, that's significant because the shroud is supposed to be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk also about a book I recently finished reading, Titus Kennedy's book, Unearthing the Bible, because in this book, he talks a lot about some archaeological finds that support the authenticity of the Bible. The Bible has been under attack, at least going back to about the 1800s, when a number of German university scholars started poking holes in it, trying to make a lot of claims about the dating of the books and the authenticity of the writers and the reliability and the validity, etc. However, the stones have cried out in recent years. It seems as if God is there listening, standing at bat and batting away all of the flies that he is tossing them. And so that is one issue. Another thing I was going to mention is a little bit on Gleason Archer's book, which is a survey of the Old Testament. So Gleason Archer is a very classical Christian. He's also has a number of degrees, high-level degrees, very smart man. And he wrote a book pretty much in defense of the Old Testament. And so I highlighted a few different points that he made that I thought I'd also bring up today. But before I start on that, I wanted to talk about Ben Shapiro for a second, because I've been watching Ben Shapiro now for a while, and I noticed that almost every time he goes to a university campus, somebody on the campus stands up and asks him about Jesus. And of course, if you know Ben Shapiro, you know he's a very Orthodox Jew. He wears a yarmulke. He really does not talk about Jesus. He does not believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the promised Messiah. But the really interesting one just occurred recently at the University of Iowa. So I think that was in the last 24 hours, if I'm not mistaken. And so he was there talking about his usual stuff. He's talking about politics and all kinds of things like that. And a student got up to him. He said, "Is he familiar with Daniel 9? And of course, Daniel 9 is about the prophecies that there would be 77s less 7. So it prophesies the exact timing when the anointed one is going to show up and be cut off. And so if you take what this Daniel 9 says, 77s less 7, you get to a time period of 483 years. So we wonder, well, when does this time period begin? Daniel was written in the 6th century BC when Daniel, the prophet, was under the captivity, starting with Nebuchadnezzar, starting around 605 BC. And Daniel concluded probably around 530 or so BC in writing. But one thing he said is, he said, when the call goes out to rebuild Jerusalem, when that call goes out, the clock starts. Okay. So if you recall, Daniel he started off under Babylonian exile with all of the kingdom of Judah, which is a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom of Ephraim, or Israel, had been in captivity under the Assyrians hundreds of years before that, 150 years or so before that. But anyway, so they were under captivity. The Babylonians defeated the Assyrians decisively starting around 609 BC. We started seeing some of these defeats. And then, of course, in 605 BC, we have the kingdom of Babylon beginning. Now, Daniel portended that this kingdom would end, and it would come to an end under the Medo-Persian Empire. And the cool thing about this book that I have is we've got some support for both Darius the Mede and King Cyrus, because they had a co-rule that occurred starting in 539 BC. So I'm going to get to that inside this book from Titus Kennedy, Dr. Titus Kennedy. So that's going to be a pretty good deal that we get to. He also, what Daniel said is, he said, okay, the call to rebuild Jerusalem. Now, when does that go out? Well, that happens to go out under Artaxerxes, a Persian king, sometime between 457 and 444, because there were two calls, one in 457 and one in 444. So if we take that time period and it carries us over to right around the period in which Jesus was crucified and resurrected. So it brings us all the way up to about 33 BC, a window of time right around that period. And so what this man pointed out to Ben Shapiro, he said, hey, we've got that. And then he said, and of course, we've also got the predictions that the second temple would be destroyed. Malachi made that prediction that the anointed one would appear in the second temple. So he said, we know it was destroyed in 70, Ben. So what's going on? You know, the anointed one had to appear. So Ben talked about Maimonides, who's a Jewish person, a Jewish scholar from in 80 times, in more recent times, who's proposed that the Messiah is only going to be a political figure. However, what Maimonides did not pay attention to was the Sanhedrin and the beliefs that were recorded in the Babylonian Talmud right around the 5th and 6th century AD. Okay, so way before Maimonides, who was around. Actually, I better double check when Maimonides was around, but I will give you that date in just a second. But all right, let's find out when Maimonides was around. He was around in the Middle Ages. He was born in 1138. So we've got very specific time on him. So before that, right around the 5th and 6th century AD, we have in the Babylonian Talmud the description that the two rabbis who are discussing exactly who the Messiah was, what kind of form he would come in, made reference to Daniel 7, which talks about the mighty one coming in the clouds of heaven, made reference also to Psalm 110, that he was going to be sitting at the right hand of the mighty one. And then, of course, he made reference to Zechariah 9:9. And he said, wait a second, there's two types of Messiah, the mighty one and the humble one riding on a donkey. And he said, if we're good, we will get the mighty one. If we are not good, if we're sinners, that kind of thing, we will get the humble one. Well, it turns out the humble one came. We knew when he'd come. So that should address some of the issues that Ben Shapiro was dealing with. Okay, we know that the early rabbis before Maimonides knew that there would be this other type of king. There was a dual type of king who would come. We're still waiting, of course, for the final coming of the king in the clouds of heaven, which we'll all be witnessing. Hopefully, it won't be witnessing in our lifetime, because I think that's going to be a very turbulent time. So yeah, Canadian Catholic, I know I don't find Shroud of Turin boring. I know you do, because I saw that you said that in my other thing, but I thank you for the super chat anyway. Thank you for viewership. I do appreciate it, but no, I definitely don't find the Shroud of Turin boring. But anyway, so I digress. What I'm trying to tell you is that the earliest Jewish people, some of the earliest Jewish recordings that came about even after Jesus had walked the earth, were rabbis who realized there were two types of Messiah who were to arrive. Okay. And so I hope, Ben, we can all say a nice prayer for Ben Shapiro. I do enjoy his stuff. I think he's very quick thinking on his feet. I couldn't even imagine going up against him in a debate. It would be a disaster, because he's so good at debating. But anyway, so yeah, the stones have cried out. So let me just point out a couple of things that Titus Kennedy found in his Unearthing the Bible book on archaeology that you might find fascinating. So one of the things that you'll find fascinating is what he calls the pre-flood world and the Sumerian king list. And what he says is, and I've got it recorded here, although the reigns in the Sumerian king list probably do not correspond to our calculation of years, or the numbers are drastically inflated, comparison between the pre-flood and post-flood reigns demonstrates that the Sumerians believed that the pre-flood kings had lifespans several times longer than those who lived after the flood. Now think about that. This is very interesting, because we have what happened in our Bible. We have, in the early parts of Genesis, people were living hundreds of years. And then, of course, after the flood, God decided that no one would live past 120 years. Now tell the modern day gods that, people like Jeff Bezos and others, and people who are thinking that there's a human 2.0 and we can extend our lifespans. God said pretty clear, no one's going to live past 120. But the interesting thing about this finding is it's giving us ancient support that humans were living past 120 at that point before this flood. So I want to commend that little discovery right there. I also think that it's important to talk about the alignment of the Code of Hammurabi with the Bible. And so that is just something also that is pointed out here. The customs, the laws, and the economy of the Code of Hammurabi and the Stele of Hammurabi were pretty consistent with what we see in the Bible. And so here's what he says. The Stele of Hammurabi, carved from basalt and standing 2.25 meters or 7.5 feet tall, was inscribed with 282 laws in Old Akkadian from the famous 18th century Code of Hammurabi. It was found during excavations in ancient Susa, but the stele was probably transported from its original location in Sapar to the place of its discovery in Susa by the Elamites in the 12th century BC. So, hey, I want to say thank you, Susan. Good to see you. So the image at the top of the stele shows the sun god Shamash associated with justice seated on a throne and Hammurabi king of Babylon standing in front of him. According to the epilogue, anyone could come to read the stele, and it was publicly erected in a public area. Okay, so it's basically what he points out here. He says the laws, customs, and prices found in the Code of Hammurabi from the 18th century BC in the Middle Bronze Age and the patriarchal narratives from the same time period of Isaac, Joseph, and Jacob in Genesis suggest that the events occurred in the same period because the kinds of payments that they were giving for particular products matched. Okay, so it helps to date the Bible to it helps to date the stories, the events in the Bible to the times where we have proposed that they come from. And again, with going back to even our patriarchs. The other thing that they found in the Mary and Nutsi tablets is that a lot of personal names that were common back then. Like, for example, it gives us confirmation that the name Jacob was very common in the area and time in which Jacob, one of the patriarchs, lived. And so that is a pretty good thing. And so a lot of times you'll see that even people like Peter Williams, Dr. Peter Williams, coming out of England, he has even noticed that the people's names in the New Testament were consistent with the names in the popularity of the names in the ancient times. For example, Susan, your name. Your name is Susan. Susan is a very common name, especially common as a choice for a child's name in the 50s, 60s, 70s. It was very common. I had a lot of friends at that time named Susan. I also had a lot of friends named Lisa and Kelly, and Mike was really common. And Dan was pretty common. So there were all these names that were common back then. Jennifer, very common name for a female. Now, if we come to the same United States, same places, we're looking 50 years later or so, 40, 50 years later. Now you see other names are common in our area. For example, in my students, I noticed a lot of students in college right now named Nick. Lots and lots of Nicks. In fact, in my classes, I have multiple Nicholases in these classes. I've even got the female version, different female versions of the name Nicolette and things like that in my classes. Really, really common. Madison has become extremely common in my classes. Kaylee. If my son were a daughter, one of my sons were a daughter, I was going to name her Kaylee. That was my choice. Or Kylie. I was looking at both of them. Very common names. So my point is that when they excavated some of the archaeology from the times of when Jesus walked the earth, they found that the names that are recorded in the Bible, the very common names, were also very common in the archaeology. For example, Simon. Simon was a very common name. That's one of the reasons why all of the times when you see Simon in the Bible, it comes with an additional term to understand which Simon we're talking about. So it was Simon this, Simon that. So Simon Peter, you see that kind of thing. So it was an additional term because it was so common. And so we can see Joseph, very common. Other names, Jesus itself was pretty common. So you can see that kind of thing, and it aligns with the times. And so again, another great archaeological finding. I want to say hi to Keith Colvin. Great to see you, Keith. Thanks for stopping by. Okay, so here we also have the Hebrew servants in Egypt and the Hebrew names. The papyrus Brooklyn, which was discovered, it's from the 17th century BC, coming out of Egypt. They think it's in Thebes, Egypt. The idea in that particular one is that the papyrus list contains a list of 95 servants, many of whom were specified as Asiatic or coming from Western Asia, primarily in Canaan. The servants with foreign names are given Egyptian names, just as Joseph was after he was promised from a household servant under Potiphar to the role of vizier all over Egypt. The majority of the names are feminine because domestic servants were typically female. Approximately 30 of the servants have names identified as Semitic. So again, giving us some confirmation that the Semitic population was in Egypt during the time that we believe around the Exodus period. Okay, so we've got that confirmation again coming from the papyrus Brooklyn. I want to say also hi to Mr. Greeny, and I'll put this out there. Thank you, Keith. I see what you're saying here. He says, the Shroud of Turin is fascinating. Thank you for your interest and your time investigating. Well, you know who really spends a lot of time investigating this is Joe Moreno. So Joe Moreno and his wife, Sue Benford, many years ago started investigating the Shroud of Turin. And Joe tells me that he knows more about the Shroud of Turin than, he knows he follows it so closely that every video, every book, every study that comes out, he's on it. And he sends emails to me all the time with updates on the Shroud of Turin. And so I'll just quickly mention what one of those really great recent findings is for those of you who are interested. I know that some of you aren't. I know Canadian Catholics not interested. But, I wasn't interested either for many years. I was the first person to say the Shroud of Turin was a hoax, thanks to the carbon dating of 1988. Let's address that right up the front. Let's bring the elephant into the room. Okay, a bunch of researchers had this little teeny snippet of the Shroud of Turin, and several different groups took a portion of that snippet of the top left-hand corner of the Shroud of Turin. According to many now, it's probably the worst place you could have pulled a little snippet of cloth because it was dirty. That's where people held the cloth when they carried the shroud. The shroud's long. It's like 14 feet long by 3 feet wide. It's a pretty long piece of cloth. Or it's a little longer. It's different than I just gave you. Forget those measurements. I got to look that up. But anyway, it's a big cloth. And so when people carried it, they touch it there. So also that was where it was more likely to fray. And so what Joe and his wife found out was that they took a little piece of the sample that they were able to get from the original shroud investigators, people like Barry Schwartz and others. And they looked at this little sample and they sent it around to weaving houses. And a lot of people told them, when they didn't know what it was, of course, and they didn't have an internal bias, they said they wondered what it was. It was the weave was a little bit different in that than in a different part of the shroud. So that was curious. So then what happened was a number of recent scholars have taken those little pieces, and they've realized there's a ton of heterogeneity in the piece that they sampled for 1988. So in other words, the new position that many people are taking in recent studies, and these are from top level people, academic studies, scientists, and that kind of thing. The recent position they're taking is that, number one, we should probably have another sample taken from a more interior piece of the shroud to be able to get a more authentic reading of the carbon dating. And number two, that particular piece probably has weave in it from perhaps going back to 2,000 years ago, and then perhaps going back to medieval times when people might have woven in an additional text. Okay, so that's just something to think about. Yeah, so thank you, Keith. He says that was a bad sample. Thank you, Mr. Greenie. I see that little heart there. I like that little green heart from Greenie. Good stuff. So yeah, so what the new findings are, and this is pretty fascinating here, the new findings are coming out of Italy. They did what they call wide angle X-ray scattering, or WAXS, WAXS. It measures the natural aging of flax cellulose and converts it to time since manufacture. Now, I'm getting this from a site called Aletia, Aleteia. And what they did is they found that they believe that this process is more desirable. That's what they said, quote, more desirable than radiocarbon dating. And they said it's also not as destructive. And the size of the sample that's required is not as small. It doesn't hurt the sample. They pointed to reasons why carbon-14 dating could be inadequate. One of these reasons, and let me quote it, here's what they said in the study: molds and bacteria colonizing textile fibers and dirt or carbon-containing materials such as limestone adhering to them in the empty spaces between the fibers that at a microscopic level represent about 50% of the volume can be so difficult to completely eliminate in the sample cleaning phase, so that can distort the dating. So Shapiro also said the fabric can become enriched with new carbon samples. So it's just a problem to use carbon sampling. But here's what they found when they used this WAXS method, this X-ray method. They were able to do that by matching this Shroud of Turin with documents or cloth that had been confirmed to 3000 BC all the way to 2000 AD. And they were able to place the dating of the Shroud of Turin. It best matched a piece of fabric that was right around 55 to 74 AD. Okay, so this method was able to date the shroud to much earlier. So you should take a look at that. And again, question, if you're really stuck with this idea that the carbon dating comes out in 1988 and you're stuck in 1988, you really need to get up to date with the scholarship. I was once in your shoes. It wasn't even that long ago I came out of it. But the other really cool thing that Shapiro found is he said that there was pollen that was consistent with the ancient region of Palestine. And now I've pointed that out on my channel before. Also this limestone. We've got some consistencies. I've made an entire video on it. It's my major pin video in this channel. So take a look at that because that's good stuff. So here's what else also we have coming out of our archaeology. So let us go here. A lot of people have tried to tell me, oh, let me back up here. Many of you have probably heard people say, how could God do how could he allow what happened to the Canaanites to happen to the Canaanites? They go back to the problem of evil. They say, how is it possible that God would tell the Israelites they had to take over the land of Canaan, push the Canaans out of there? Anyone who fought against them, stayed and fought, could be killed. And one of the things that the answer to that is in the Bible. The Bible makes it really clear that these people were quite corrupt. And God waited till the last minute with these people. He wanted, at least if there were some good people in that crowd, he wasn't going to destroy the whole population. So he waited and waited very patiently. But what they were doing during this time is they were sacrificing their own kids. And they would do it because they would think they would get better crops. In fact, we have evidence coming even all around the world in places like the Aztec tribe in South America and other places that a lot of people groups were sacrificing their children with the expectation that this would give them blessings from the gods. That's what they believed. And so I've had people tell me in the past that no, we have no evidence of child sacrifice in the ancient times. It just wasn't happening. Or they might say, oh yeah, there was some evidence, but we can't really point it out that it's to Canaan. Well, oops. The posomoral relief found in Canaan also gives us some evidence for sacrifice going on in that area. Okay, so this is 6th century BC. This is not talking about the period of time of the original Canaanite conquest and the stuff coming from Moses when he, after the Exodus. Of course, that was much earlier. That's coming from hundreds of years before that. But we have evidence that the culture was very corrupt and this kind of stuff was going on. So just in case you're wondering, it gives us evidence of all kinds of child sacrifice. In fact, let me just quote here. Hold on, let me just get a good quote for you so you guys can hear about this. The stone monument, again, this is coming from Titus Kennedy. The stone monument contains a variety of scenes, including one depicting child sacrifice. This particular carving shows a seated god on the left who is holding and about to consume a child inside of a bowl. A figure to the right that is offering a bowl towards the god, and a third figure with a, what is that, sickle sword, who is grasping another bowl with a child inside of it. See what they had, and I want to say hi, thank you so much, Shiami. What they had is they had this god Baal or Molech. They had these different gods, and a number of different gods back then that they worshipped in ancient times. But one of the things that they had was like this horrible looking figure of this grotesque beast. Looked rather satanic, if you ask me. And it was holding a huge bowl. This was a statue of a figure of a grotesque beast holding a huge bowl. And they believed if they burned their infants inside the bowl, that the infants would, what they did was they just sort of melted to death. The mothers and everybody would be screaming, and they would play very, very loud music to try to overcome the screaming and the howls and the crying and all that kind of stuff that was going on. I mean, these people were just downright ghastly. And to do it, and they witnessed, because of this, they found all kinds of evidence. In fact, here's what it says right here. Several specialized cemeteries used to bury the burned bones of infants, fetuses, and children have been discovered in various Phoenician cemeteries around the Mediterranean, including Carthage, where approximately 6,000 urns containing burned human bones were found. While child sacrifice had been adopted in Judah in the 8th and 7th centuries BC until King Hosea destroyed the Zophets, or locations on fiery ovens associated with human sacrifice by fire, and put an end to the rituals, human sacrifice had been practiced centuries earlier in Canaan. Okay, so that's pretty scary stuff. And he also reports here, at the Amen Airport Temple, from around 1400 BC, a large outdoor square stone altar was discovered with over 1,000 burned bone fragments, the majority of which were human remains. The human sacrifice was probably associated with the cult of Molech, which is attested by a dedication inscription and temple at the Amen Citadel only about 4 kilometers from the airport temple. Okay, pretty gross. A 13th century BC text from Ugarit, north of Canaan, also mentions the offering of a child to Baal in order to drive away an attacking enemy from the city, which is a practice shown in a 13th century BC stone relief in Egypt depicting the siege of Ashkelon by the Egyptians. So let's sum up what we find here. This gives us evidence, not only starting with what we talked about right up front, with this particular finding called the Pozo Moro relief. What we also have found is a lot of evidence of infant sacrifice going all the way back to the time of Moses. Okay, so when people say, oh my gosh, these people, oh poor them, God is in the position to determine when people's life begins and when it ends. And unfortunately, living such a corrupt life sometimes can give you an ending that comes pretty soon. So I want to say also hi to what we have here. Yes, I agree, Shiami. Let's do that. Keith Colvin says a lot of smoke contamination from the fire, but I don't think the smoke is much of a factor. How many babies drowned in Noah's flood? That's a great question. We don't know. We don't know. We do know that where they are right now. That's what we do know. They're in heaven. And all right, so here's another thing. The Merneptah stele. Okay, so that's another one. So here's what this is about. It's an Egyptian stone monument of about 10.4 feet tall with a 28-line hieroglyphic inscription describing campaigns of Pharaoh Merneptah against Libya and Canaan in the late 13th century BC. And it lists some gods and some of the other things. So again, this helps to provide support that there was also the name Israel, which appeared on that. So if people said, when did Israel come about? When did we first hear the Israeli name, the nation of Israel? It's coming about around 1219 BC under the Merneptah stele. Okay, so we've got that kind of stuff, which is pretty cool. We also have the casting off of idols, and this idea coming from the Baal statue and altar. And so under that, we have that kind of thing. The Baal Hadad, and that's the king of the gods in the pantheon of Canaan, was a storm god, often depicted in an action pose wielding a lightning bolt, similar to Zeus. Okay, so that's coming again from Titus Kennedy. So what do we have here at Hazor? Excavation of one of these pagan temples showed the full extent of the destruction by the Israelites. The temple had been burned. The head of the idols had been cut off, including a basalt statue of Baal Hadad. The cutting off of the heads and hands was not only physical destruction of an idol, but it symbolically depicted them as powerless gods. So here's what it is. It's evidence that the Israelites went into these temples where they had these horrific gods. They were doing quite nasty practices in the temples, by the way, where they were having public sex and doing all kinds of other rather grotesque things in the practice to imitate their gods. That's how they believed their gods were. They believed their gods were highly sexualized beasts who appreciated watching incestuous relationships and bestiality and all kinds of other really non-normal things, okay, abnormal things. We also have evidence from the collared rim jars that there was a settlement of Dan, okay, the settlement in Dan, again, going back to give us some evidence of the Israelites around the 12th century BC and their existence. So that's, again, the collared rim jars. What else do we have? Here's a good one. King David. Up until a certain time period, people denied King David's existence. They thought he was fake. Thankfully, the Tel Dan stele totally blew that notion away. We've got the House of David listed in there. Sorry, folks, but that is a big one. Again, the stones have cried out. You guys might as well go home if you're thinking of anything else. Now, I found this one. You can't really see this picture, I guess, but there is a picture here of an oil. This is really funny. When the Jewish people, and this is apparently late in the reign of King Jehu of Israel, around 820 BC, Jehu destroyed the worshippers and the temple of Baal. And what he did as a specific act is he put in there a toilet seat to symbolize how dirty it was. And so there's this toilet seat. It's an Iron Age toilet seat, and it's located inside of the destruction of this temple that the Israelites had done. And so I think that's funny. It's called the latrine of desecration. So that's just another rather amusing little sidebar. What else do we have? We also have Oh, the prophet Isaiah. And I've done a lot on the prophet Isaiah. Again, I want to say thank you to you guys who are coming in here. Great to see you. Let me just bring my other screen up. Hold on. Oops. So the prophet Isaiah, he lived between right around 700 BC. And he's one of the greatest prophets of all times as far as the Bible goes, because he's made a significant number of prophecies that were fulfilled. Jesus referred to him a number of times. He also was referred to by people like Paul, and there's a lot of authenticity in his works. He prophesied when living under Assyrian rule, under Assyrian exile around the, again, 7th century BC. He prophesied that the Assyria was going to fall to Babylon, which it did way after he died, and that happened around 605 BC. He also prophesied that the second temple, or the first temple, which was standing at that point, was going to be destroyed, which was under Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. Of course, then he prophesied that the Medo-Persian kingdom would be taking over from the Babylons, and that, of course, happened too. And so he was very specific, and he even named the king, the Persian king Cyrus. And he says right in Isaiah that I named you, God named you, Cyrus. And so a lot of people have taken the book of Isaiah and put it under fire, claiming that it was written by a long line of Isaiah followers. And they situate all of the fulfilled prophecies to the time of the events happening, okay? Because they are so uncomfortable with the idea that Cyrus was named that they make the claim that some other guy living in Persia somehow is able to magically slip in the passage about Cyrus into all the different copies around the whole ancient Near East, all the copies that went around to everybody's little copies and said, here, I've got this little insertion. Go ahead and update your account. Update your scroll. I've got an insertion. Here, stick this in there. I've got this insertion for you. Oh, I've got to travel about 50 miles north. I got to go give them the new insertion. I mean, come on. If you really think through that proposition, it's absurd, just totally absurd. But I digress. One finding that confirmed Isaiah is the Bulla of Isaiah. So that is the prophet seal. And so this is just this little bulla, a clay bulla. It's made from a stamped impression of a signet ring, and it was found in Jerusalem, and it refers to Isaiah. And so it's, again, just giving us a little archaeological piece of evidence in support of Isaiah. Then, of course, we've got support for Hezekiah and the water tunnel. That's what they call the Salome Inscription. And that's something that was around 701 BC. And the Salome Inscription, and I'm going to read what it says here. In 1880, a boy discovered a 6-line inscription inside the water tunnel and only about 19 feet from the opening of the pool of Salome, or the pool of Hezekiah. Okay, remember King Hezekiah, that was under Isaiah's time. He was one of the rulers during Isaiah's time. However, the inscription was later cut out of the wall, removed, eventually placed on display in Istanbul. The text recounts how the stonecutters used axes to excavate through the neck along the fissure from both sides. So anyway, what it is it's, again, giving us evidence of people who were named in the Bible, like King Hezekiah. This fall of Nineveh is also something that was pointed out in the Nineveh Chronicle. So there's just another pretty exciting find. Let's move ahead here. Now, he's got 101 findings. I'm going to give you just a snippet. I hope you'll go and buy his book. This is coming from Titus Kennedy. Another thing that was found is King Belshazzar. This is one of my favorites because, again, the atheists, they hate this idea that Daniel somehow is able to predict all kinds of events. And they feel that that what happened in 165 BC under Antiochus Epiphanes could not have possibly been known by a 6th century BC prophet named Daniel. They think that's absolutely impossible because Daniel was so specific about the abomination of desolation. And he described to a T what happened under Antiochus Epiphanes that put the people who are these believers, non-believers, especially starting. Now, this whole idea did not even start until around 285 AD under Porphyry, when he wrote a book called Against Christians. And he said, oh no, Daniel must have been written in 2 BC. There's no way the man could have known about that. Why do they say that? Well, they say it because they're very uncomfortable with prophecies because they know the theological implications. Very uncomfortable. Makes them squirm and itch and get all itchy and scratchy. And so anyway, Belshazzar, he's mentioned in the book of Daniel. Now, for many years, people who were these scholars out of places, especially in Germany, going back to the 1700s and 1800s, especially under the very anti-Semitic views of some of the people living in those universities, living near those universities and working in the universities, there was a lot of anti-Semitism around there. And they would look down at the Jewish scriptures and they would say all sorts of things about the Jewish scriptures to discount the validity of not only the scriptures, but the people themselves. And they said that Daniel had made up this king named Belshazzar. There's no such thing as King Belshazzar. Well, the stones cried out again. The Nabonidus Cylinder came out and specifically named Belshazzar, who was reigning alongside his father Nabonidus during the time when the Persian kings came over and overtook them. So we've got the Nabonidus Cylinder naming Belshazzar, taking that whole theory and kicking it to the curb. Sorry, folks, parks closed, moose outside, should have told you. We also have proof, okay, more evidence from the Nabonidus Chronicle. If it's not even worse enough for the people who are non-believers who are trying to kick against the goad, Jesus said you can't kick against the goad. It's a problem. Sorry, folks. Parks closed. Moose outside. Should have told you. All right. So I'm quoting here what Titus Kennedy says. A cuneiform document recorded on a clay tablet and called the Nabonidus Chronicle corroborates that there was no battle for the city and makes it clear that Cyrus was not leading the army at the capture of Babylon in 539 BC. Instead, a general from Media led the Persian army to Babylon and subsequently ruled the day as a governor. So the idea is Darius the Mede. Daniel reports Darius the Mede. We also have reports of King Cyrus. So we've got these two kings. Daniel also said there'd be two kingdoms co-ruling. So Cyrus and Darius rule together. Darius is the one that we didn't have any other support for. We've got lots of support for Cyrus. So the issue here is saying that there wasn't a fight. Belshazzar was busy drinking. All right. He was partying it up with his friends. He had just gone and raided the Jewish temple, taken a bunch of gold goblets. They were partying it up, having a good old time. And all of a sudden, Belshazzar looks at the wall and there is a literal hand on the wall writing, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. What is that? Only Daniel could translate it. So Daniel said, sorry, Belshazzar, but your days you've been weighed in the balances and found wanting. And then he said that, of course, he was going to be captured tonight. He was going to be killed tonight. And that happened. So according to this Persian document, the Nabonidus Cylinder, the Medians came in. They didn't even put up with a fight. They dug a little hole, were able to penetrate Babylon. They dug a little hole through the river underneath and came in there and took over, and Belshazzar was no more. And so we saw that. So there was a co-regent ruling there with both Darius the Mede and the Persian King Cyrus. All right. So what does the Cyrus Cylinder say? So that also gives us some evidence. So we have evidence from the Cyrus Cylinder of the existence of King Cyrus, what his beliefs were, how he was actually a pagan believer. He was a believer in a different God. And so that's one of the reasons why Isaiah talks about him being a believer in a different God. And then, of course, God talking to him. And I would think that Cyrus hopefully had changed his position at that point. One of the most amusing findings to me for the fight against the scholarship of people who are lamenting the truth, the Dead Sea Scrolls, wonderful, wonderful findings. That happened around 1948, as you know, at the Qumran. The Dead Sea Scrolls give us evidence in support of ancient Bible. We go back to, say, 200 BC, 100 BC, in the first century BC. The Dead Sea Scrolls were written. They predate the New Testament. Oh, Redeemed. Let's see what this is. So Redeemed says the Shroud of Turin is so obviously real, you'd have to be ignorant or have an agenda not to see it. Thank you for your continued interest in the Shroud. Definitely not boring. Thank you, Redeemed. That encourages me. I also noticed my Shroud video got a lot of views. So I thought, seems like people are interested in this. So maybe I'll keep looking into it. And I'm very interested in it because I find it also sort of an amusing thing that it seems like time and again, more and more evidence is accumulating in favor of the Shroud of Turin. Also, I want to say thank you. I'm going to put that super chat back up there. It was very generous of you, Redeem channel. Everybody go over to Redeem channel and subscribe. If I assume you have a channel, since you're called Redeem channel, I'll have to go find that too. So thank you so much. And then Utopia Buster 2017 says, hey, Zhang, on a scale of 1 to 10, put your level of ignorance at 20. Oh, Jesus. That's, oh boy. AOC. Yeah, AOC. It's like AOC. Well, I think AOC was flirting with Elon Musk from what I saw on Twitter. He said he's shy, though. He doesn't want to deal with the flirting. Speaking of good times, Elon Musk buying Twitter is probably one of the best pieces of news that we heard in a long time. I'm an independent. I kicked the Democrats to the curb a long time ago, a couple of years ago, I should say, probably 2018, somewhere around there. I kicked him to the curb and I came on over to the middle. And so I'm an independent now. I will choose my candidate based on policies. And I want to go for the ones who are going to give us the best free speech, freedoms. I want to make sure that it's in search of the truth. That's one thing that I'm going to really make sure of. If people are telling you things that you know are not scientifically true, like, for example, a fetus is just a clump of cells and life doesn't begin at conception. Human life doesn't begin at conception. And that personhood must magically be conferred at some strange arbitrary point during the birth cycle. Come on, what's wrong with these people? And then that's not even the beginning. I won't get into the other stuff because I want my channel to stay up. But just keep looking at what they're doing, what they're trying to do in the schools. It's cray-cray. And I will get into that later sometime. Okay, so we also see Herod the Great and the temple. That's another thing. So the longer ministry. What's interesting that Titus says here that I had not ever heard about. A lot of people talk about Jesus's ministry lasting about 3 years. So I've said before on my channel, we have evidence going back to someone called Steinman in 2009 and some other scholars, Nolet, other people like that. They have looked at the death of Herod. And when I first got into Christianity, got back into Christianity, I thought the death of Herod was set in stone at 4 BC. And the reason I thought that I hadn't looked into, and then I started reading academic studies on when the true death of Herod occurred, because they said if Herod died in 4 BC, Jesus had to precede him, right? And so they thought Jesus maybe was born in 6 or 5 BC. However, when we actually look at why people think King Herod died in 4 BC, it's because they're looking at something Josephus said. Josephus said there was an eclipse just before the Passover, and Herod died in this period between the Passover, or around this Passover and eclipse deal. Now, there was a very weak eclipse in 4 BC and a very narrow window of time between the eclipse and the Passover. And in 1 BC, there was a very strong eclipse and a much bigger window of time between the eclipse and the Passover. I think it was January to April, something like that. So it was a much larger window. Well, Josephus listed a bunch of activities that Herod the Great completed before he died. And these were after the eclipse. So what happened in these academic studies is they say there's no possible way he had enough time in that narrow window of time in 4 BC to complete all of those activities. So now we go to 1 BC as our date for King Herod's death. Now that puts us to some interesting thoughts. So when was Jesus born? Well, there is actually the Pater Patria, which was very likely that Quirinius was governor at that time, but the Pater Patria was a call for a census of all of Rome. Everyone had to go register in their home cities. And of course, Joseph and Mary went to Bethlehem into their home city to register. And so it's likely that they did that either in 3 or 2 BC. And of course, Jesus was born. Early church fathers have supported 3 or 2 BC as the dates of Jesus's birth, by the way. So, hi, Utopia Buster, good to see you. Taking Back Eden, also good to see you. Says aliens have never contacted Earth. It's impossible for aliens to get to Earth. That's the problem. They've noticed that the only possibility of life on planets is far out. It's at least 20,000 light years away. So there's no way a carbon-based being could make its way 20,000 light years. It's impossible. So you will not have another carbon-based being suddenly landing on the Earth. So the question is, what are these experiences that people are having? Well, I think the vast majority of them are just in their minds. They're fake. But there is a chance that there's residual UFOs and there is some demonic activity in a different dimension. And I've talked about that with Hugh Ross on my channel. So I encourage you to listen to that. He's actually written a book about little green men with Ken Samples. It's really good because he talks about how do we explain some of these experiences that people have had where they've been physically harmed in a really detrimental, terrible way. How do we explain some of the other things where it looks like somehow people, the rockets are going faster than possible and a lot of things like that. And so he's got some good stuff to say in his book. Here's another thing, the Moses seat, the Magdala Stone Moses seat. So there's a big seat. It's gigantic. It's around the 1st century AD. And it's in the period of Jesus, of course. And so there's this gigantic seat. It's from the synagogue. The town of Magdala was one of several fishing and fish processing centers located around the lake during the 1st century AD. So discoveries in the town included commercial buildings located at the port, weights for fishing nets, a mosaic depicting the Galilean fishing boat, pools used for the processing of fish, a fountain house, and 1st century synagogue, and of course this gigantic carved seat that was what they call the Moses seat. Hey, Otangelo, good to see you. Yeah, good to see all you guys. The Shroud of Turin. Yeah, I have talked a little bit about that. Otangelo, those of you guys who just joined, I talked about the Shroud of Turin because there's another discovery that just came out of Italy. And so it's a discovery that has dated the Shroud of Turin to 2000. It's also discounted the carbon dating because of all of the flaws associated with carbon dating and contamination potential. And so it's discounted that. It comes back, dates us around 2000 years ago. And so it gives us a little bit more support for the authenticity of the shroud. Aside from the fact that there's blood found on the shroud that penetrated the fibers, that seems that there was some sort of a radiation of light, significant radiation of light, almost like a nuclear radiation of light at the time when the shroud appeared that burst the image of Jesus onto the shroud. So if you've seen my other videos on that, I go into great detail on that. I also detail how they found pollen, limestone, all kinds of other sorts of evidence that dates it to the first century AD. So that's just something there too. Now, some other atheists online have also said, we don't know where Jesus was buried. We don't know where the empty tomb was. And then they say, well, how could you even believe in Christianity because we don't know where the tomb was? Well, that's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And from what I've heard about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is that there's kind of when you bring in electricity measuring tools and things like that, apparently when you get very close to the tomb in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, there's a lot of activity, a lot of radioactive activity coming out of there. And it's really interesting. And so I think you might want to look into that. But also in the tomb of Jesus, one of the discoveries was the burial bench in the Holy Sepulchre. And so I'll just read here what he says. Let me just see here if I can see this. Because easily cut limestone was available throughout the region, people utilized tombs carved into rocky hillsides or shafts into the ground. Okay, so we've got this with chisels. That's how they did it, most with chisels. And so they just looked at this place in the in the Holy Sepulchre, and they found where they believed that Jesus was laid. And of course, that's giving us confirmation. Now, remember, he was going to be buried in a rich man's tomb, and that's according to Isaiah 700 years earlier. And he was buried by Joseph Arimathea in that tomb. Now, that's not cause for excitement. Joseph Arimathea, of all things, was a Pharisee. The Pharisees were the ones, of course, who persecuted and had Jesus crucified. But there were some good Pharisees. Nicodemus was one of them. Zacchaeus, Joseph Arimathea. So there were some good Pharisees. The interesting and sort of embarrassing thing was that none of Jesus's family were there to help him. I mean, assume we didn't hear about it in the writings. They're not there at the scene of the whole event. So where was John? He was there. He was the only one that was reported to be there. Where was Peter? He wasn't there. The rock wasn't even there. Where were all of these other apostles? That's what's crazy. Okay. So another thing that supports do you remember in the book of Acts? Many of you probably can remember this, but in the book of Acts, we have the idea of worshiping an unknown God. We have Paul who traveled and he went to different places and he told them, he's kind of scolded these people he was talking to. And he said, you worship an unknown God. There's an altar to an unknown God. Well, we found the altar to the unknown God. 1st century BC in Palatine Hill, Rome. Okay. The altar to the unknown God. Again, giving us more confirmation for some of the New Testament stuff. And then the trouble at the Jerusalem temple. That's the interesting thing, the temple warning inscription. So after Jesus is resurrected, there was a lot of trouble, a lot of people, a big uproar. You know, if you remember from the book of Acts, the apostles pretty much turned the world upside down. And so one of the things that occurred was the Romans at the time outlawed people from going into graves and removing bodies from graves and doing things like that. And so they thought, some of the ancient Jewish people thought that Jesus, his friends, had removed his body from the grave. Now, just remember, this caused such an intense uproar that the Romans and the Jewish people would have done whatever they could possibly have done to retrieve that body. That body's in a heap, wherever it was. It had been removed, it's hidden, it's buried, wherever it was, they would have done whatever it took to retrieve it. But the body was never recovered. So that's pretty important to mention. Okay, and then of course we have James, Jesus's brother. If for the Jesus mythicist among you, like people like Godless Engineer, Jesus mythicist, Richard Carrier, these people who believe that there isn't even, some take it so extreme they believe there was not even a man or a person called Jesus in the first century. Some say there was a man, but we crafted a legend around him, complete legend. Some say the whole thing is a big myth. It's a concoction. It's completely devoid of any historicity. It's a ridiculous thought. But one thing that upended that idea was the ossuary. An ossuary is a little burial square box. And they found the bones of James, Jesus's half-brother, in that ossuary. And so it's called the James Ossuary. So that's just a couple of the findings from this book, Unearthing the Bible. Really, really good book. I also want to recommend this other book here by Gleason Archer. It's called A Survey of the Old Testament Introduction. I'm getting through that book, but one of the things he does in every single chapter in this book is he goes and he looks at the scholarship and what people are saying. Now, again, Gleason was writing mainly in the 50s and 60s because he is no longer with us, but he was combating a lot of the stuff that the people had been saying that were trying to discount the validity of the Bible. And that's just what he did. And so he did that, and he went chapter by chapter in the Bible into all these different prophets and refuted them quite well, quite handily. So yeah, let's see what Otangelo says here. Let's see. The shroud bears the ultimate triumph of the resurrection of Jesus, meaning salvation. All this is recorded supernaturally on the Shroud of Turin, which proves the Holy Bible to be forensically accurate. Yes, amen. I totally agree with you, Otangelo. And in fact, when you're looking at the shroud, again, try to understand the fact that nobody can figure out, even with all of our scientific discoveries and our scientific knowledge, scientists are completely baffled over exactly how that image appeared on the shroud. However, they went and they looked in Nagasaki and Hiroshima at the fallout of the atomic bombs there. And you know what they found? They found images of people that had been projected onto sidewalks and sides of buildings. So it was kind of like when the radiation went through Nagasaki and Hiroshima in Japan in the 1940s, 1941, when the radiation went through those areas, somehow the people's images were burned onto the walls of these buildings and these sidewalks. I've shown that in my other videos. But the idea with that coincides with the shroud is that as if the radiation is coming out of Jesus, like there's light, this massive radiation of light coming out of Jesus and just whoosh, appearing on the shroud. And he's left us with enough evidence to support him. Not only has he left us with the Bible, the written word, he's left us with the stories of the apostles and why they were so brave, why they did what they did, why they came out of hiding and preached and practiced for him for decades before sometimes being beheaded or crucified upside down or burned or boiled in oil. All those kind of things happen to these people, and they just wouldn't give up. Why? Because they knew that they were preaching the truth, and the truth will set you free. They also think about what else Jesus left us. So he left us the Shroud of Turin. Okay, through this entire book of archaeology, there's 101 archaeological discoveries that correspond to biblical life. Okay, and I named a handful of them. But just think, every time that somebody makes a claim, like for example, as I mentioned earlier, people saying, oh, there's no Belshazzar, the book of Daniel historically inaccurate. And then suddenly Belshazzar appears on the Nonbelievers cylinder. It's kind of funny. Or they say there's no King Darius, no Mede was involved. Cyrus did this, Cyrus did that. Well, Cyrus was working with Darius, but Darius was the one who went in there, according to the Nonbelievers Chronicle, like I mentioned. So you keep looking at it, and it's almost like God's in the driver's seat. He's in control, and that's really good. That's a really good thing. So anyone have any questions or thoughts or anything else? Let's see what Otangelo says here. Zheng Fukusheng is also here. I don't know if I said hello to Zheng. Got taken back Eden. So he says the total power of the VUV radiation required for instantly colored the surface of a linen, corresponding to a human body of medium height, equal to corpor body surface area 34 1,000 billion watts. Yeah, just think about that. One of the things that you're going to notice in the book of Isaiah is the constant mentions of the light. Okay. You mentioned it in the New Testament, and the light was going to save us. The light's going to set us free. Let your light so shine. All this mentions of the light. Jesus is the light, the way, the truth, and the light. The way, the truth, and life, but also the way, the truth, and the light. He's the light of life. It's one of the things in Isaiah 53:11. It says, after he dies, after he's crucified, basically he said he's going to be pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. But in Isaiah 53:11, it says, but then he will see the light. And John, in his gospel, says he will see the light of life. And so it corresponds with that. Isaiah 53:11, that idea of he will see the light, that corresponds again with what happened at the resurrection, but it also corresponds to being the light, being the word and the light, the logos. So we've got some pretty good stuff there. So let's see what else we have here. Zhangfu Sheng and Talking Back Eden. John, it's good to see you guys going back and forth here. Otangelo says something else here. The wide presence of creatinine particles bound to ferrihydrite particles in the blood of the shroud is related to patients suffering from strong polytrauma-like torture. Yeah, now I'm not a scientist, obviously. I can't really speak to that, but I can say that apparently there were also very high levels of bilirubin in there, and that was consistent with somebody who had been tortured and beaten and very much stress. That's one of the reasons apparently why the blood appeared red rather than sort of blackish, because of the bilirubin. They also found that the image, how tall Jesus was, actually pretty tall. He was around 5'11", if I recall that correctly. So there was that sort of thing as well. And so there's just a lot of pretty cool things. Let's see what else I wanted to say about that. They also found that the blood type was blood type AB, which also is interesting. So Jamie says, let's see. How do you explain the text saying there was a folded and separate head covering that Jesus folded up? Yeah, there was. So we have the Shroud of Turin itself, which was a very high quality linen, very, very high quality linen, very tight weave. Okay. And then there was what they call the word's on the tip of my tongue, ovarium, the sudarium. Let me just double check that word. Oviedo. Oh yeah, the sudarium of Oviedo. So that was this little cloth that Jesus used. Both of those were found. Both of those date early. The cloth also had lots of blood, and the cloth itself, the sudarium of Oviedo, was a much lower quality. It wasn't the high level quality that the rich man Joseph Arimathea bought. Maybe it was a cloth that somebody gave Jesus while on the road or whatever, on the cross, walking on the cross, or walking to the cross, with the cross, I should say, to the crucifixion, to Calvary. But one of the other things I wanted to point out in the shroud is the humanity of it all. Apparently, the man in the shroud, there's evidence that there's sort of a crown-like thing on his head that poked holes, blood coming out there. There's evidence of over 100 whips, like whippings. Okay, so there's evidence the way the blood was on there, that the man who had been whipped over 100 times. There's all that other kind of evidence. There's evidence that there was a big gush of blood that came out of one side of him, which again is consistent with what John reported. John said he saw the blood in the water. That's consistent with what was found. Also, what some have said is they said that there's consistency in these coins. Apparently, when people buried people in the old days, in ancient times, they would bury them, and to make sure their eyes didn't open, they would put coins over their eyes. Well, apparently, the particular coins that appear to be over Jesus' eyes are consistent with the coins of the time of 1 BC. I'm sorry, 1 AD. So they're consistent with that. And that's an interesting thing. So yeah, Zhang says they keep the sudarium locked up in a casket, bring it out twice a year or something like that. Yeah. So that's the other deal. Now, Tangela says, however, it does have blood stains and serum stains from pulmonary edema fluid, which match the blood and serum patterns and blood type AB of the Shroud of Turin. Oh, I have found something pretty fun. So I have my ancestry.com, and always it's shown me that I come from Northern and Western Europe, mainly from places like England and Norway, and sort of to the right around the area of Northwestern Europe and a bunch of different places, Ireland, those kind of places. But suddenly the new update shows that apparently less than 1% of my blood, my DNA, comes from the Levant area. So it comes from kind of around Israel. I think that's really cool. So I'm pretty excited about that. But it's less than 1%. So I probably can't do jumping jacks and get really excited about it, but I'm pretty excited. So I think that's a pretty cool deal. So the other thing about the Shroud of Turin that you might want to consider, again, is just looking at its history and looking at what people thought about it through history, looking at how it had been probably hidden. You realize a burial cloth wouldn't be something considered, say, clean. So, but it was also treasured because, of course, it showed an image. Now, the very interesting thing is that when you just look at the image on its face value, you can kind of make out a face a little bit. But in 1898, a photographer developed film for the very first time that gave us the black-white image that you see today when you look at the shroud and the images. And so you see the photographic image, which gives us much more clarity on the way that the person looked in the shroud. And that's what drew all kinds of attention, probably rattled a lot of those atheist cages, and people sort of in a desperate mode decided they have to figure out ways to deny that that is the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. But again, the simple explanation is it was. The simple explanation is Occam's razor. Let's just take the best explanation for the evidence that we have. And that is that it's Jesus. And so that's the way, the truth, and the life. So yeah, so Mr. Greeny says, I thought the coins were for something different. Yeah, maybe they were. That's what I read in this couple of studies that I read where they were talking a little bit about the coins. And so the studies are much different quality. The ones that talk about the coins I didn't find those in the high level peer reviewed journals, the ones with the coins on the eyes. I found those more in more popular level works where people talked about that. So it's not one that I talk about quite as commonly. We don't need it, just like we don't need the Shroud of Turin to have evidence that Jesus resurrected, but it's a huge bonus. And it's something that Christians can take out there and share with their friends and try to bring people to the kingdom. That's really what the end goal is, right? So people want to know the truth for those who want to know the truth. Of course, there's this culture today that's propagating non-truths, wants us to believe all kinds of things about our bodies, all kinds of things about what we've got as women and bearing babies and the value of the baby inside us. And they don't even they say a fetus is not a baby. I've heard the craziest things lately. A fetus is not a baby. I mean, imagine. Fetus is not my unborn child. No, I'm sorry. The fetus is my unborn child. You give a fetus life, time to grow. It will turn into a beautiful little human. So yeah, Otangelo says multiplying. Let me put this one up here. Multiplying the evidence on the shroud and the probabilities, the odds that the man buried in the shroud is Jesus is 1 chance in 82,944,000. That sounds good. Exactly, because all the different things that surrounded his death, it's really consistent. There was one other point I wanted to make, and I don't remember what it was. Unfortunately, I had something I wanted to build on the shroud just to support its authenticity, but and I'll just be honest, when I started looking into the evidence, here's how it started. I'll just go back a little bit so you know where this came from. Again, I was of the belief that the shroud was a hoax. So what I did was I was watching Steve McRae's channel, and he had a guest on there. And I think that Steve didn't know what the guest position was on the Shroud of Turin. And he was kind of shocked to find out that the guests believe the shroud's authentic. And that sort of got my eyes and ears, got my attention. I thought, wait a second, he thinks the shroud's authentic. Who thinks the shroud's authentic? I thought nobody did. So I decided to go out and do my own little investigation and to see what the academic literature was saying. And I was shocked. I couldn't believe the amount of literature recently in support of the Shroud of Turin's authenticity. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to weigh the evidence against it. The points against it are that they hadn't found the shroud for many years. It didn't really surface for the public to see until around 1300s. So that's one of the big pieces of evidence. 1200s, 1300s, right around there, we start seeing evidence, the shroud coming out. And then, of course, during the years after, people having the shroud in different places when it finally makes its way to Turin, where it's viewed apparently very rarely. You can go out and see the shroud. They don't bring it out for humans to see that often because they don't want it to get ruined with light or anything like that. But anyway, so the evidence against it is that we didn't have anything out there being reported. However, we do have reasons to believe why we wouldn't have that. And it'd be basically because people were protecting it. It's probably protected by a different order of people who were Christians, who were trying to keep it away from the public because they, of course, didn't want it to be destroyed by the enemies of Christianity. And so that's just something that's food for thought. It's consistent with what we see in the Bible. It's consistent with all of that. So anyway, I'm getting ready to go to dinner with my family, my mother-in-law, and some good times ahead. We're going to head to Carrabba's and have a good time there. So I know I'm not going this early, but I'm going to go downstairs and have a little chat with them. My sons are getting back from the gym, so we're going to get going. So it's great to see everybody. Please like, subscribe, do come again. And just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do it all for God's glory. Thank you.